This happened in the summer of 2007. It was told to me by the two girls who experienced it, who were friends of mine at the time, and also a couple. This is important for later. It all happened in central Italy, in Lazio, the region where Rome is, and I need to give some context about it. The area around Rome is full of hills, most of that region is, and underneath many of these hills sit ancient Roman pre-Christian catacombs. So many, in fact, that they're not even that big of a deal for the locals, and some of these catacombs even got converted into wine cellars or basements over the centuries. Some haven't. Again, this is important for later. Now, these two girls, which we'll call E and C, were in their early 20s, had been together for a year or so back then, and given how ludicrously expensive rents in Rome are, decided to try their luck finding a flat in one of the small towns around that area on those hills I've mentioned. Mind you, those hills aren't ominous at all. If you've ever seen pictures from Tuscany, that's what they look like, which is rather lovely. And they did find a small apartment for rent in one of those towns, a renovated flat on the second floor of a much older house, which isn't surprising at all in that region, as many houses are centuries old and just get renovated from time to time. On the ground floor of that apartment, there were some neighbors, but they never got to see too much of them. A couple of apartments with old people living in them. There was also a very old, sturdy wooden door, which was always closed and locked by a padlock. And when they asked the landlord where it led, he told them it was the door to some old cellar nobody really used anymore, and supposedly was connected to one of the catacombs I've mentioned earlier. Again, it's an ancient country, and such things don't come across as particularly weird to us. Neither did it to E and C, who just shrugged it off like, okay, makes sense. So, E and C spent a few months in that town, not really bonding with anyone, mainly commuting from there to Rome and back for work and study. However, being a homosexual couple in an old town full of old and bigoted people, they quickly started noticing how unwelcome they really were there. They'd go to the local store to buy food, and the clerk would ignore them on purpose. They'd find their mailbox emptied and all of their mail scattered over the floor outside their apartment. They'd even bump into people riding scooters around town, passing them by and yelling, "Goddamn lesbians." In short, they didn't have the best time there. But they knew it was only a temporary solution, so they decided to just endure it all while waiting to move again. And yes, FYI, Italy is still majorly conservative on the topic of LGBTQ, even more so now than 16 years ago. Then one morning, as she was stepping outside to go to the car and drive to Rome, E found something on the ground right in front of their flat's door. A mussel shell had been placed there, with a doused red candle in it, and judging by the mess it made and how short the candle was by now, it had been burning for the whole night. Not knowing what to do with it, she picked up the shell with the candle and threw it in the garbage, together with all the wax she could scoop up from the floor. Another thing she noticed when she finally set out to leave was that door, the sturdy wooden door downstairs that had always been closed up to that point, wasn't locked anymore. The padlock was gone and it was open just by a crack, but she didn't really pay much attention to it right then. But then things started happening. At first, it was an uneasy feeling. E and C would be in their living room, sitting on the couch, reading, chatting, watching a movie, and suddenly they'd have this feeling like someone was watching them. Later on, it became more than that. They'd hear noises around the house like someone knocking on the walls in another room, or the toilet flushing on its own, water taps turning on by themselves in the kitchen. Quickly, it became less bearable. One night, as they were sleeping, they both woke up in the middle of the night hearing the footsteps of bare feet in their living room. They started listening. It felt like the footsteps were simply pacing around, and there was nothing else. No voices, no items being moved, just the sound of bare feet in their living room. After a while, C, feeling understandably scared, whispered, "What's that?" to E, and as she did, the footsteps stopped, as if noticing her voice in the silence of the apartment. They stopped, and a split second later they started sprinting towards their bedroom. E grabbed C and turned her face away from the door, doing so herself, just moments before the footsteps came through their bedroom's door and stopped to the side of the bed. "Don't look, whatever happens now, don't look," E told C, and held her in her arms for the rest of the night, neither of them sleeping, just listening in for those footsteps to finally leave, or whoever it was to do something, anything at all. But nothing happened. They spent the next 3 hours wide awake, in silence, until dawn came, and with that bit of sunlight finally shining through, E found the courage to turn around, and nothing was there. Another night, E, who was in university at the time, was up late studying in their living room as C was sleeping. Like I said before, it was summer, and the window in the living room was open. She wasn't facing it. The window was to her left as she was sitting at the table taking notes. Suddenly, she felt the hair at the back of her head stand and had that familiar feeling of being watched, so she instinctively turned to the window. She described what she saw as a completely pitch-black human-like figure perched on the windowsill, with no features on its face except for 2 very large orange glowing eyes, who just stood there motionless and stared at me. She couldn't tell me for how long she stared at it. She told me she felt completely paralyzed and helpless, and had the feeling that, had she tried to move or do anything, that thing would have lunged at her. Eventually, she couldn't hold it anymore, turned around and closed her eyes, took a long, deep breath and looked again, and it was gone. After that, they contacted their landlord and decided to leave for good. They did so within a week since that event. The last thing E noticed as they were finishing packing their things up and leaving was that big wooden door, the one which had been left open ever since all of those events had begun, was now once again closed and locked shut with a padlock. I hope you enjoyed. It's been 14 years since I was told all of this, and ever since then I've never shared outside of conversations with a few trusted friends. I had been meaning to write it down eventually, but never got around to it. And no, sadly I don't know the name of the town where this all happened. I'm not in touch with E and C anymore, so I couldn't find out even if I wanted to. But knowing myself and what a massive dumbass I can be, I don't much mind not knowing, because I know I'd be tempted to go and take a look on my own, and that doesn't sound like it'd lead anywhere constructive. Several years ago, I was in my early 20s and ended up in a relationship that shouldn't have ever happened. It was a mess from the start, but that's a story for a different sub. What made it worse was the creepy house he lived in. The house itself was beautiful. It was a large, older house with a beautiful staircase, 3 bathrooms and 5 bedrooms. It had basically been gutted and rebuilt. I often wonder if that had a hand in all the weird phenomenon. While it looked beautiful, it didn't feel homey. It felt lonely and empty. Initially, I chalked this up to its size and need for more homey decor. Of course, there was the cliché feeling of being watched, which I'm no stranger to, especially at nighttime when we would be watching TV with most of the lights off. A long hallway branched off from the living room, and I felt like someone was glaring at us from the dark corridor. All stuff you can shake off. My first real "oh crap" moment was one evening after I got off work. He texted to let me know he'd be working a bit later, and to go ahead to the house and let myself in to freshen up. This house had an amazing bathroom with a jacuzzi tub on the lower level, so I jumped at the chance to get in and relax. After filling the tub up with nearly melt-your-skin-off hot water, I laid back with my eyes closed. This euphoric moment was interrupted when I heard the front door down the hall slam. I could hear what sounded like heavy boots shuffling around before they started stomping down the hallway. I heard every aggressive step until they stopped right outside the bathroom door. I knew he was home and must be in a bad mood, and was ready for what could be a crappy evening. Several seconds passed, but he never entered or said anything. I also never heard him walk away. After a good minute or two, I called out his name with no response. I had talked to him about my feelings about the house, and he had admitted he felt the same and had had some freaky experiences since living there. I then realized he was trying to mess with me and would probably bust through the door to scare me any minute. I called back out to him, letting him know not to bother, that it wouldn't work. It was met with eerie silence. I decided the whole relaxation thing was over and got out to confront him. I opened the bathroom door to absolutely no one there. I admit I was shaking as I looked down the hallway to see if he was trying to hide, but again saw no one. As I went back into the bathroom to get my phone to call him, I heard the front door open again and could hear him setting stuff down. I come down the hall and he greeted me. He seemed to be in a good mood. He made a joke about knowing I'd be in the bath when he noticed my robe. I was practically speechless. He asked what was wrong and I explained what had happened. He waved it off, saying he heard that stuff all the time. "You get used to it," he said simply. He was right. I heard this quite frequently, both when I was alone in the house and we would both hear it together at times. Another time we were sitting on the couch discussing what to get into for the day. It was bright and sunny outside. We were discussing maybe going hiking when all of a sudden the front door burst open with such force, the door made contact with the wall behind it and bounced off of it. We both were stunned for several moments until I spoke up and said the wind must be bad outside. He remarked about how there was literally no wind outside and we walked out onto the porch to a very still, pleasant day. Another evening, it was just getting dark out and I was watching TV alone while he was in another room working on something. I never put much thought into orbs or took the whole orb thing seriously, to be honest, until that night. As I'm watching TV, I see what looks like a small circular ball of light come down from the staircase from the corner of my eye. I turned to look at it head on and it floated below the TV and up the massive shelf to the right of the TV. I watched it float all the way up to the top, shelf by shelf, until reaching the ceiling and vanishing. I was covered in goosebumps and I felt terrified. I knew there was nothing that could have caused that. All the windows were sealed off with the blinds closed as well as the heavy drapes. I also did not hear a single vehicle pass by at that time. The TV was also on a low volume. I ended up calling for him to come to the living room. Again, I sputtered off like a terrified idiot. He seemed to actually be a bit freaked out by that himself, but said it didn't surprise him. Whatever it was, it liked being noticed. I'll leave off with one experience that I still get insanely weirded out by when I think about it to this day. We had both fallen asleep while watching TV one night. I remember it was in the middle of winter and it was cold in the house, as keeping the large house heated in low temperatures was both hard and expensive. I was on one end of the couch and he was on the other. I woke up with a start and felt very disoriented. I then reached for my phone to see what time it was, only to feel even more panicked when I saw it was nearly 5 a.m. I had to work that morning in less than a couple of hours and I did not bring my work clothes with me, as I did not plan on spending the night. I threw the blanket off of me to get up and grab my shoes and keys when I noticed my ex was wide awake, sitting up on the other side of the couch looking at me. I was taken aback as he had such a strange look on his face. I asked him what was wrong and why didn't he wake me up sooner, as he knew my work situation. He just shook his head and slowly looked away. Odd, but I didn't have time to really get into it with him. I just needed to hurry and make the 30-minute drive home to get ready for work. As I got my shoes on and got my keys, he asked me to please not go yet until he was ready. I went to ask him what he was getting ready for, as I knew he was off that day, but he was gone down the hall to the bedroom before I could ask. He came back a couple of minutes later, fully dressed, and was putting his coat on. I then asked where in the world he was going. He told me he was going to his mother's house, which was just a few houses down from his own. I looked at him like he was crazy and told him, "It's 5 in the morning. Surely your mom is asleep." He told me it didn't matter. He had a key and would rest on the couch until she got up. Again, I was weirded out, but also pressed for time, and mentally noted to ask him about this later. We walked outside, said goodbye, and he headed straight to his mom's. Later in the day, I had texted to ask him about it, but he said he'd rather explain in person. After I get off work, I head to his house and wasted no time asking what had gotten into him. He seemed reluctant to talk about it, but did start to tell the story. He said he had woke up a little before me. When he woke up, he too was disoriented at first, but quickly realized what had woke him up. He said it felt like someone was hitting the back of the couch. As he started to wake up more and realized that wasn't possible, he suddenly locked his eyes on me. I was still sound asleep when he said it was like something took over him. He felt himself start growling. His teeth were clenched together so tight that his jaw ached, but he couldn't control it. He said he could feel he was showing his teeth as his growls got deeper and louder. He explained that the growls were so animalistic that he could not imitate it. The whole time he could not look away from me. While he felt this strong feeling of anger come over him, he also said another part of him was wondering how I was not waking up, as his growling had become so loud that his ears were ringing. In reality, he said it probably only lasted 15 or 20 seconds, but to him, it felt like it was much longer. Just as suddenly as it started, he snapped out of it. As the growling stopped, he was able to relax his jaw and look away from me. He said he sat there for several minutes while I never once even moved. He said he couldn't decide whether he should wake me up or not. He was so confused. When I did wake up and went to leave, he was so shaken by the whole experience, he was scared to be alone in the house. Hence him asking me to stay so he could get ready to go to his mom's until daybreak at least. Other things happened, but that last one always got me. Did whatever that thing was want to hurt me? Want him to hurt me? I was honestly relieved knowing I'd never have to go back there once we split for good. He's moved since, and I wonder what the new inhabitants have experienced. I've never really had any reason to be truly scared. Looking back, there isn't one experience I can think of that truly terrified me. I've jumped countless times from sudden, loud noises or catching something move in my peripheral vision. I cannot recall ever fully screaming or shouting, but maybe that's because I'm not a very outspoken person anyway, and would rather mask my feelings from others. I lost my eldest daughter once. She was 2 and we were in B&Q, a hardware store. They have model bathrooms and kitchens. There I am admiring some taps or tiles or whatever it was. I turn around to the shower she was messing in and poof, gone. That was terrifying. But I wasn't scared, more frantic. Full disclosure, I found her taking a dump on one of the display toilets. Not my proudest moment having to tell the employee they needed a cleanup in aisle 6. Anyway, so I haven't ever really been terrified, except once. It happened back when I was 17. I'd left school that summer and had 6 weeks before starting college. It was baking hot in the small rural town that I lived in. Situated pretty much in the middle of England. It's an old coal mining town and a bit of British history here. All the mines were closed down, which decimated both the economy and job opportunities of the small pit towns throughout the country. Back to my town, if you're old enough, or at least look old enough, you spend your time in the local pubs. If you're not, you have nothing else to do but roam the streets, seeking your own entertainment. Me and my friends were the latter. On the main road through town, away from other houses, stood a dilapidated house known as the O'Briens, a 4-story, 6-bedroom mansion compared to all the other houses in town. There was an old couple who lived there who, at this point, had passed away some years prior, called, you guessed it, the O'Briens. They had 2 daughters who had moved abroad and had never claimed the house, so it just sat, for years, building up dust and rotting away. A perfect opportunity for somewhere cool, private and exciting for 6 teenagers to hang out. The house had a ridiculously big back garden, which was equally ridiculously overgrown. It literally took us the good part of a day to stomp down a pathway through the nettles and brush. Once through, there was a garage that we could drop down onto, which we pulled up the roof of to gain access. We spent nearly all summer in that house, hanging out, graffitiing the walls, drinking, smoking, etc. But there was one room that eluded us. From the garage, you headed through a kitchen, which now only consisted of a broken window that had been boarded up and a damaged set of cabinets on the back wall. You then stepped into a hallway which looked right through to the front door, with a bathroom and 2 other large rooms on the left-hand side. On the right were the stairs to the 2nd floor. The staircase was built against a wall and had wooden planks running vertical. Directly opposite the kitchen door, built into the back of the staircase, was a large metal door that had been painted white, the paint now a sickly yellow dusty color and flaky. This door was locked. It simply wouldn't budge, and looking at the hinges, it opened inwards. The house was big enough that we just kind of forgot about the locked door. We'd spend most days up in the 2 rooms on the 3rd floor, away from the road outside to avoid any passerbys hearing us and phoning the cops. That was until one of the lads decided, for no apparent reason, to light the moth-ridden curtain on fire with a Zippo he was messing with. The curtain, dust-covered carpet, and old, crinkled wallpaper went up in seconds. We only made it out by smashing the top window and jumping into a dirt mound at the side of the garage. I think, if adrenaline hadn't been coursing through us, it would have been a hell of a painful fall. We hid in some bushes over the road and watched the fire engine put out the flames, but before it could, it had engulfed the second and third floor. The second was still usable once we got the courage to re-enter the house, but the third was gone. Just the outer walls and what was left of the roof. Shame, really. So, we were confined to the bottom floor. The garage was too dark to see in, and only had an old table we'd found that you'd normally use to put the paste on wallpaper. We used it to get in and out of the roof. The kitchen wasn't much brighter, and the front room had a big bay window that overlooked the footpath and road outside, so that left us a small, bleak back room to chill in, which got boring very quickly. Boredom led to curiosity, and I noticed that one of the wooden planks on the side of the stairs was loose, and that there was an open space behind it. Finally, we could see what was behind the metal door. What a mistake that was. They say curiosity killed the cat, but in this instance it questioned my whole belief. The wooden panels were surprisingly hard to pull off, even for 6 fairly athletic teenagers, so we went out scouting and brought back a few torches and a crowbar. It was still a slog, but we finally managed to remove 2.5 of the panels. Shining the light into the hole revealed another staircase that led downwards. Yet, it looked as though it was decades older than the rest of the house. Cobwebs engulfed every surface, and the stench of musk and damp attacked your nostrils if you got anywhere near the hole. After some giddy behavior, some pushing and shoving, and a game of 6-man rock, paper, scissors, I grabbed a torch and slowly stuck my head through the hole. The room was darker than dark, so dark that the beam from the torch could be seen cutting through the blackness. I shone it down the staircase first. It went down deep. The hole we had made was maybe 4 or 5 steps from the door, and there were at least 25 below it. At the bottom, a wall, and a doorway to the left. I swung the torch to the right, towards the door, not expecting to see what I saw at all. The door was definitely locked, tight, with 3 separate deadlocks that ran down the side, all barred. But what caught me by surprise was on the small lip of the top step, pushed firmly against the door, was a really outdated fridge, the ones that were squared and about waist high. I told the lads stood behind me and they laughed, thinking I was joking. One by one, they stuck their head in the hole, checked out the bottom of the stairs and then the fridge. Each one as confused as myself. I remember sitting down, smoking a cigarette and debating how and why it would be there. The door clearly opened inwards, which meant the door must have been locked from the inside. Then somehow the fridge put up against it from the inside. We spent the rest of the day checking the garage and surrounding area of the house for a trapdoor or another entrance exit to the cellar, but couldn't find anything. We put it down to the sheer size and state of the garden and went home. The next few visits to the house was us trying to decide who would enter the cellar first. No one wanted to. And no matter how many games of rock, paper, scissors we played, it was always best out of a higher number. Until one day I'd had enough. They were in a circle in the other room, messing with stuff and just generally chatting. Except me, I just sat and stared at this hole, this dark void in the wall. Finally, I got up, exclaimed my intentions, took the torch from my pocket and stepped inside. Everyone else quickly and very excitedly followed. Immediately, the first few layers of the wooden steps just disintegrated under my feet. They turned into a mulch of damp splinters that clung to the sole of my shoe when I lifted my foot. It was worrying, but the stairs seemed sturdy enough. Each step I took downwards, the temperature dropped rapidly, and the air seemed to get thicker and thicker. The inches of dust that I kicked up didn't help also. Admittedly, I was a little scared, but I had 5 other lads behind me, so it was impossible to turn tail now. I headed down and reached the second to last step. I could see the doorway, which led to an open room. Pausing, I regained my courage with a few shaky, deep breaths and stepped through. The room was in a worse state than the stairs. Webs littered the rafters and floorboards above like moss. They hung from the ceiling in clumps, all tarnished with dust weirdly. Thinking about it now, we never saw any spiders though. The floor was carpeted in a layer of debris from the rotting wood above which consisted of dust and dirt. It was a miracle none of us ever fell through the floor above. This place was a mess. The room was huge, expanding underneath the bathroom and both rooms on the first floor. And it was dark. There was no light source, other than the torches 3 of us now carried. The room stood empty, except for a wooden table smack bang in the middle. No chair, nothing around it. But in it stood a metal plate, crudely bashed into shape, with the remnants of a black goo on it. Next to the plate stood a tall, uncorked green bottle. One of the boys went over to it and picked it up. It sloshed as he did so, with a liquid of deep brown and layers of dirt inside. I never smelled it, but apparently it was putrid. At first, we didn't see the other doorway. It was in the corner directly opposite the one we had entered. No door, just total darkness. We tried to shine our torches through it, but they didn't seem to cut through the shadows. It was like there was actually a door there, one that drained the torchlight. For some reason, I didn't muster the courage to go into that room, and neither did anyone else. We simply turned and left, feeling like we'd had enough adventure for the day. Over the next week or so, we invited girls and other friends to the house, but all refused to enter the basement. We found this hilarious, and would dare one another, more to show off than anything, to go down there either on our own or in pairs without a flashlight and see how long we could stay down there. Now, not once did I get scared while stood in complete darkness down there. It was kind of calming, but none of us ever got the courage to enter the other room. In hindsight, we should have questioned more why the door was metal, or why it was locked from the inside, and how a fridge got up the stairs and placed in front of the door as a barrier from the inside also. But full of excitement and immaturity, it never crossed our minds. We just assumed that there would be some sort of other exit in the other room, which led to the garden. Word quickly went round through the year groups of the O'Brien basement, and we definitely fed the rumors of it being haunted. Teenagers would ask us how to get into the house, and for us to show them the barricaded door basement. So, because we thought we were cool, we spent another day making a maze in the garden, squashing pathways down that led away from the garage. We would then invite people into the house, lead them through the garden into the garage, and show them the hole in the stairs. It got quite popular, and we decided to cash in on the opportunity. We told people that if they wanted to see the basement, then they would have to do the initiation. As they came in, we would have one person sat on the fridge and another at the bottom of the stairs, both with torches, and send the people into the first room, telling them that they had to stay in there for 10 minutes, with the torches turned off, and then we would let them out. This went on for a while, and it was fun at first. A lot of people bottled it as soon as the torches were turned off, but some stayed. We'd cheer them back up the stairs when they completed it. It was a cheesy little ritual we created, but still everyone refused to go into the other room. When questioned, they just said they didn't feel comfortable, until my little brother and his friend came. They were 2 years younger than us, and initially we refused to let anyone who wasn't our age into the house. We were there all the time, and there were 9 of us in the friend group, so it was pretty easy to deter people away if they managed to find the entrance at the garage. But after constant pestering and the initial curiosity of others dwindling, we decided to invite them along. We made a big deal out of it, taking them to the dilapidated fence at the back of the garden, and tying their jumpers around their faces as we led them blind through the maze of shrubbery and thorns to the garage. It was a decent drop from the hole in the roof, and even though my brother managed it, his friend had to be lowered down by his arms. Once inside, they were met with the stench of smoke that lingered from the floors above. We walked them through the kitchen and showed them the makeshift entrance to the basement. We told them the story of the metal door and how it didn't make sense, and gave them the option of staying in the first room in pitch black for 10 minutes, or go in the second room in pitch black for 5 minutes, an offer a lot of people initially picked until they got down the staircase. "Second room," they said in unison. We all laughed, expecting them to change their minds immediately. One of the lads slipped through the hole in the wooden boards and turned right, heading up the stairs and positioning himself on the fridge. I went through next and positioned myself at the foot of the stairs. I'd just like to say, at this point, all of us regulars felt complete comfort going down to the bottom of the stairs practically alone. We'd all taken it in turns when bringing people down here, and had done it numerous times each, so this time was no different. There was a giddy, nervous atmosphere when the two youngsters entered the staircase. The torches we used were cheap ones we'd gotten from the market, so they cast an eerie yellow glow. Slowly, my brother and his friend made it down the stairs, clearly attempting to save face and act unmoved by the state of the rotten, decaying wood around them. But as they trenched through the mulch, they stuck close together. They took their time, so much so the guy at the top shouted for them to hurry, and both nearly shit their pants. When they finally got to me, I told them that this was the first room, shining the torch around the room through the doorway, and that they were to go into the next one, aiming my beam through the darkness to the frame of the other door. The room was a decent size, and as stated, the torches were cheap, but I remember taking notice that the beam that cut through the first room never seemed to illuminate the second room at all, as if there was an object obstructing its path. My brother's friend walked into the room, and as my brother walked past me, I grabbed his shoulder and told him that he didn't have to do this, and if he did, then he could back out whenever. With a nod and a dismissive wave, he followed his friend. They crossed the room, passed the table, and disappeared through the second doorway, as if walking through a dark stage curtain. I hit the button on my Casio watch to start the countdown from 5 minutes. I then aimed the beam of my torch up the staircase. The guy sitting on the fridge smiled excitedly and looked at his watch. "I really need to do a piss, dude. I'll be right back," he said, jumping down and disappearing back through the gap. I stood at the bottom of those steps for what seemed like forever. I could hear the faint giggles from across the first room. They seemed muffled, as if hearing voices from behind a door. "How long left?" my brother's voice shouted. 3.5 minutes, I replied, checking my watch. Now in the basement, despite it obviously being underground, there was never an uncomfortable temperature. It was never really cold. There was never a chill. And, while being down there countless amounts of times, not once had any of us felt any sort of breeze. But, and this memory still haunts me a little, especially when there is a sudden shift in temperature, I noticed that I became very cold as I stood at the bottom of the stairs, to the point where I could see my breath when checking the time against the light on my watch face. The mumbles from the other room had stopped also. I tried to focus on them, see if I could hear any movement or the nervous noises they had been making before, but nothing. I remember getting freaked out. I don't know what about, but I could feel my heart beating faster. The hairs on my arms and the back of my neck stood on end. I turned on the torch and stepped into the first room. "Yo, you guys all right?" I called out. Nothing, no reply. "Oh, stop fucking about, time's up." I called again, and again no reply. I shone the torch through the doorway of the second room, but just like before, it was as if the beam cut through the first room and then stopped at the doorway. I crept closer, calling my brother's name, but he never replied. Then, as clear as day, so loud it hurt my ears after the silence, a voice, deep, brash, and distorted, as if the sound had been twisted, bellowed, "Leave, now!" I froze on the spot, eyes fixated on the doorway. Then, emerging from the gloom, ran my brother and his friend, both as white as snow, both with tears and snot streaming down their faces. The look of pure terror on their faces is something I have never been able to get rid of. They bolted straight past me, which snapped me out of the trance, and I followed suit. Before we could reach the doorway to the stairs, the sound of crashing came from the stairwell. 4 ridiculously loud bangs, and the noise of snapping wood. The fridge was embedded into the wall at the bottom of the staircase. Without stopping, we all scrambled over it. The staircase itself was a complete mess, large splinters of wood stuck up like spikes. Luckily, and I don't know how, we managed to clamber up on our hands and feet without injury. Halfway up, I looked towards the hole in the wall, praying it would be in reaching distance. Both the young lads were in front of me, both sobbing and screaming. Both ran straight past the hole in the wall. The metal door, locked from before and with no key, which we looked everywhere for, now stood open. Light from the garage exit spilled through the kitchen and down into the basement as if it showed us the quickest way out. Instinct had set in by this point, and all 3 of us darted through the door, onto the table, and up through the garage. My brother's friend, too small to get down on his own, managed to get out without help. We ran through the garden maze. At some point, I had to grab hold of my brother to stop him from going down one of the many dead ends we had created, and without word, took the lead. We raced to the fence, squeezed through the hole, and collapsed on the field behind the property. I looked around, and there, also sat on the grass staring at the three of us, was everyone else who had been in the house. No one said a word. Everyone looked as scared as each other, except for the two younger boys. They wept for a long time, actually, as we all just sat there in silence and let them do it. Once they had stopped, we all got up, without a word, and went home. My brother said nothing to me on the way, or when we got back. He went into his room, I went into mine, and that was the end of that. No one went into the house again. It stood for a year or two, then was demolished. Apparently, one of the daughters had finally come over and claimed the land, only to sell it to some new build project. Now, a group of 6 houses sit where the garden and house were. Nice-looking houses, to be fair. My brother still refuses to walk past that estate. They never built on the land directly above the cellar. Apparently, and I've never actually had this confirmed, but the builders refused to fill the cellar in for some reason, just bricked it up and left it as open space despite being able to fit a perfectly good house on there. We only brought it up once within the friend group, and only because I convinced myself that it had been one of them that had opened the door somehow and moved the fridge. But they all swore it wasn't. They said that as soon as it started getting really cold in the house, they got spooked. They heard the voice and headed for the kitchen, noticed the door was open when they heard the loud bangs and bolted. I tried asking my brother about the room, but he completely shut down when I did. He quickly stopped being friends with the kid who went down with him, said they no longer had anything relevant to talk about.